Today is Friday, September 17, 2010. My name is Mark Depew, the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Today I have the opportunity to interview Senator Phil Rock. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
This is part of the Jim Edgar Oral History Project, and for other people of your stature, we have done pretty extensive interviewing, and we certainly plan to for some in the future as well. But in your case is a little bit different because Ed Wojcicki of University of Illinois at Springfield has done a major series with you already. So our focus is going to be almost exclusively on your relationship with Secretary of State and then Governor Jim Edgar. So I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule. I understand we have some time limits to deal with, and we will certainly try to honor those. But if I can get you just very briefly to tell us when and where you were born, and then we'll take it from there.
Born in 1937 in the city of Chicago, a little hospital on the west side called St. Anne's.
Did you grow up in Chicago then?
And grew up, was born and raised, yes, in Chicago.
Well, go ahead.
Went to the Chicago private school, Catholic school, all my academic career in high school and grammar school.
Well, it looks like you were a very young man then when you were first elected to the Illinois Senate. That was in 1970?
1970 was my first election to the Illinois Senate, and yes, I had the opportunity to replace one of the old lions from the Senate. Thomas Arthur McGloon was the minority leader of the Senate when he decided to step down and asked me to take his spot in the Senate.
What district was that?
That at that time was the 18th district, which, as you know, in those days, in those first early elections, the districts ran across county lines. They don't do it anymore, but it did then. So that my district was in part the west side of the city of Chicago and the eastern part of the suburban community, Oak Park, Elmwood Park. I'm trying to think what else was in there, because the district was pretty large. And the following election was the first election where the hagographers, the people who drew the map, separated out the city of Chicago and the rest of the state, the suburban community. And
so that would have been following the census of 1970 and the redistricting, the result of the redistricting then. Mm-hmm. Well, this is an inevitable question, but Mayor Richard J. Daley was in power at that time. What was your relationship like with Mayor Daley?
I had the opportunity when the committee, the local representative and Senate committee, picked an individual or a couple of individuals to run for empty seats. I was lucky to be chosen to run for the Senate seat, and one of the first things that happened to us, my partner in all this was Michael Madigan, and Mike and I were picked on the same day and went through the routine on the same day. The routine being, frankly, we walked up to the mayor's office and introduced ourselves and had a nice chat with the mayor. The mayor kind of gave us a little talk about what he expected as the leader of the party from those who ran under the Democratic label, and frankly was quite charming and quite bright in terms of what politically it meant that we were now chopped into little pieces as opposed to having a big district. So it was quite an interesting time.
Was that the first opportunity you had to meet the mayor?
Yes. I had met him, frankly, in a couple of social situations, but just a handshake and a move along.
Okay. I know that Mike Madigan and the mayor's son, Richard M. Daley, were both delegates to the Constitutional Convention. You were not a member of the delegation, were you?
I was not a member of the delegation.
Had you had any political office before being elected to the Senate in 1970?
No, that was my first elected political office. I did attempt to become part of the Constitutional Convention, and there's simply given the gerrymandering that went on, there simply wasn't room. We had to have so many of one ethnic group and so many of another, and then you had to follow the geographic lines to be true to the map that was drawn. So it was the competition was heavy.
It looks like you moved up very quickly once you got to the Illinois Senate. You were selected after the '72 election. I take it you had one of those truncated terms those first 2 years.
Correct.
And then you ran for a 4-year term in '72.
We finally ran for a 4-year. Yeah, we ran for 2 and then finally a 4.
But you were selected as assistant minority leader already by 1973.
Yes, I was fortunate that the opportunity arose to assume one of the command seats, one of the leader seats, and I readily went after it.
Okay. I was looking for my chart here. Who was the majority and the minority leader at that time then?
Russell Arrington was initially, when I got into office, Russell Arrington was the Republican leader,
but he had had a stroke by '73.
He had had a stroke by '73 and left him pretty well incapacitated, right? Tragic loss for the state.
Did you get a chance to work with him some in those first 2 years?
Yeah, just a little bit, a few months, and he was.
Well, he was from the opponent party. He was definitely a Republican, but tell us what your impressions of Russell Arrington were.
Russell Arrington was a great fan of the legislative process, a great fan of government, as a matter of fact, and was as able a politician as I've ever met. He was on top of it all the time, knew the issues, knew the people, knew the ramifications, the consequences of the issues. He was quite something, and a great example for those of us who were a little younger.
Well, having said that he was the most able politician, when you've dealt with both Daleys, with Michael Madigan, with George Ryan, Jim Thompson, Jim Edgar, you still put him in that category?
Well, I don't mean to do it in an exclusionary sense. There were others that were equally or better qualified. I'm saying for sure that Russell Arrington was one of the top politicians that I ever met.
Okay. Cecil Partee, he would have been the minority leader and then the Senate president in '75 and '76 as well. Tell us your thoughts about Cecil Partee. Did I say the name right?
Cecil Partee is correct, and in 1975, I think it was the first time that a Democrat got elected to the presidency of the Senate, and Cecil Partee was the winner, and it was quite a joyous day when he was selected as the Senate president. I can remember his mother was there. She was quite elderly, and quite a few of his family were there, and it was really quite a happy day for Democrats in Illinois.
Did you have an opportunity in those early years, perhaps while Jim Edgar was working on Arrington's staff, to meet the future governor?
Yes.
What were your first impressions of him?
That he was a very smart young man in terms of his staff duties, and very dedicated. And we used to meet and talk from time to time, just as you do in the ordinary course of business. We had some legislation we were working on in common, he was in those days kind of easier to work with. Let me say that, easier to work with. He wasn't quite so hidebound. He got a little testy in the later years, but when he was working for Russ Arrington, he was a model staff guy and a good one.
Did you see any ambition in him or desire for a higher office at that time?
Wasn't that apparent? I think most of us that go to Springfield harbor some thoughts of higher office or even leadership offices. But he didn't strike me that way. He knew what he was about, and he was busy with what he was about, and wasn't looking that far ahead or looking into the future while ignoring the past.
Moving right along here, 77, Thomas Hines is elected as the Senate President, and I assume by that time you're the Majority Assistant Leader. Would that be their proper title at that time?
Yeah, I was the Majority Leader.
Okay.
And Tom was elected. As you recall, it was a very contested election. We went through about 70 ballots, 79 ballots. We had an intramural fracas in our caucus, and we couldn't agree. So the roll calls just kept coming. I guess they were trying to wear us down.
Well, in talking to Governor Edgar about this incident, he suggested that Hines was selected ultimately because he was closer to Daley. Would you characterize it the same way?
I think it was pretty plain that he had the support of the mayor, and that meant a great deal.
What had happened in your relationship with the mayor in the interim period?
I think the relationship was still good, respectful on both sides, but he had made a choice that Tom Hines was his horse and he was going to ride it. And I had held no ill will about that. That's the business. That's the name of this game.
Mm-hmm. It was about that time that David Shapiro was the minority leader, the Republican minority leader as well. Your relationship with him?
Yeah, I did. Yes, I did.
How would you characterize that?
I would characterize that as he was one of the most gentlemanly gentlemen I've ever met in the business. He was a very knowledgeable member of the Senate, did his homework, always very polite, very engaging with the other members. And they all liked him. He got along virtually with everybody. And very able guy, quiet, soft-spoken. But you always knew he was there because he always had something good to relate to the crowd.
This would be about the same time period, April of 1979 to January of 1981, that Jim Thompson surprised a lot of people and picked Jim Edgar to be his legislative liaison officer. Were you surprised by that pick?
No, I was not. We had heard about it on the Democratic side.
Of course, he was in the House at the time he was selected for that.
Right. He was the House chief of staff, and everybody kind of expected that if there was going to be a move, he would move over. So it was no real surprise, and I think probably good for the institution.
As one of the leaders in the Senate, then, you would have had an awful lot of opportunity to work with Edgar and his lieutenants, those other people in the office who were representing Governor Thompson at the time. Tell me about that period of time and your relationship with him.
Yeah, that was kind of a tradition in the Illinois General Assembly that the staff people for the leadership of the other party or of the other house would welcome a meeting with the staff of of the other house or the other party. I mean, it was kind of a reciprocal understanding that the staff would be shared with, the information would be shared with the staff as best they could, or as best for the interest of what they were doing. And it worked out very well. Staff people have a tendency to talk in a little more trenchant way. They move through the issues as opposed to a lot of hail fellow, well met, shake hands and all that. They just did their business and they were out, and it worked out very well.
Well, that's definitely the reputation that Jim Edgar had at that time and still has, that he was generally all about business and not necessarily good at the political schmoozing side of things, if you can say it that way.
I think that's a fair statement, and not a bad one. He had a job and he did it.
And the impression I got from talking to him about this period was he spent a lot more time working with the House, working with Madigan, working with George Ryan, those two people in particular, than he did on the Senate. Would that be a fair characterization as well, as you recall?
I think so, yes. That form of reporting, if you will, that form of informing was better liked by the House people than there was the Senate people. Just one of those quirks, nothing personal. They just felt, the House just felt more comfortable with the talking about and getting used to the staff that they were working with.
Well, this is the time period, again, that Thompson is the governor. Now, before that time, you had Dan Walker in some of your early years in the legislature, and you got there when Ogilvie was governor, but then you got Dan Walker, who most would characterize his relationship with the legislature was rather chilly. And most have characterized Thompson's style of working with the legislature as much more intimate. Was Thompson one who would come down and visit the Senate?
Yes. At a moment's notice, a drop of a hat. He would love to come down and visit. He was a visiting guy.
You recall any anecdotes that would illustrate that?
No, he was easy to get along with. Didn't visit just for the sake of visiting. He had a purpose in mind. Always did. May not have been apparent when he walked in, but pretty soon he got around to business as to what he wanted to talk about. And he was very effective at it. Very effective at it.
So you have the governor himself coming down to the floor of this House in the Senate in your case, and you have Jim Edgar and a couple of the other assistants coming there as well. Was that an effective team? Did Edgar reflect and do the bidding of the governor in an efficient way?
Yes, he was a very efficient young man and knew the bounds beyond which he ought not step, and so he was well schooled in the art of trying to bring the other party around. When
you say he knew the bounds, what exactly do you mean? Are there some
examples
you can give
that when you get into that other office, or when you're in that situation where you're part of a bigger crowd talking about legislation, you're a little careful as to what you say and how you say it and to whom you say it, and he was very good at that.
He was more careful, or you were more careful, or going both directions?
Yeah, I think in both directions. I was certainly more careful, and I know he was. It wasn't our place yet to come up with the final solution.
Okay. How about your perception of him and his political future? By that time, did you think that here was a guy who had ambitions to go much higher?
I would say to the extent that anybody paid attention, and you didn't always pay attention to what each and every member was doing or what they were contemplating with their own districts and their own future. But I think it's fair to say that people kind of expected that Jim would run for office, that he had acquitted himself very well with the staff function, knew the issues, got to know a number of the members, and was a natural.
Okay. I'd like to read you a couple quotes that, and I've had extensive conversation with Governor Edgar by this time, and just read you a couple quotes that dealt specifically with you. Here's one. Phil Rock was well known for sitting down and having drinks. They'd sit down and they'd solve problems. You think that's an accurate characterization of yourself?
To sit down and solve the problem, yes. The drinks were a beer once in a while.
Of course, this is coming from a guy who is well known for not drinking at all.
Right. That's right.
Do you think because he wasn't social in that respect, he wasn't the kind of person who would hit the bars with the other legislators in the evening and work that way?
Yeah. No, I think that there's more to it than that. I think I'm not quite sure what his religious bent is, but it's obviously it does not seem to include the alcohol. Some of the members, yes, they walked out of the building and to the nearest bar and had a beer with their friends and then kept going. But Jim didn't do that. And I think people respected him for that. They recognized that. I mean, when he got to the mansion, it was certainly obvious, and nobody quarreled with it.
You don't think that affected his ability to do his job as legislative liaison then?
No, I do not.
Okay.
I do not. I think people respected his views and let him go.
Well, again, I mentioned he spent more time dealing with the House and George Ryan in particular, but also with Madigan, obviously. And here's how he characterized the Senate leadership, yourself and Shapiro. On the Senate side, you had Phil Rock, who was a prince of a guy, and Doc Shapiro, who was a prince of a guy. And then he had this qualifier here, and this is really what I want you to respond to. Neither one of them could deliver that many votes.
Neither one of them could deliver that many votes. That many being some significant number, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would have to disagree with that because the record will show that I did it more than once, delivered the votes. I mean, but again, that points out the fact that he had a different modus operandi than either me or Dave Shapiro, and Dave was not a headhunter, was not a vote getter. Able guy, knew the facts, knew the law, was very, very good, but just didn't get involved in the fray the way some others did.
Well, some of that, I don't want to read too much into this statement that he made here in this quote, but some of it sounds to me like it's, you're making the inevitable comparison with the way the House works, and especially with Mike Madigan, and what's going on in the Senate. Your understanding of the control that Mike Madigan had in the House at that time, what would that be?
It was not anywhere as strong as it is today, certainly, or it was yesterday. But it was there. There was no doubt about it. Mike Madigan was all business, is all business.
Okay. This is roughly also, now let me kind of back up. In 1981 then, Edgar is selected by then Governor Thompson to be the Secretary of State. Doesn't have to go through the election process because I believe it's at that time that Dixon gets the Senate and he leaves the position of Secretary of State. So that gives Thompson the ability to pick a very young Jim Edgar to be Secretary of State. Were you surprised by that move?
Yes, and I think a lot of people were. They really expected kind of one of the old war horses to receive his natural tribute and have a run at the Secretary's office.
Well, the name that has always come up is George Ryan. Was that who you thought should have been or would have been the natural candidate?
Should have been, I think. Yes.
Well, why?
He just was, he knew the system, he knew the people, highly regarded, easy to cross the lines to talk to the others. He just had all the moves. He's been, a long time county board member, house member. He was all over the place and doing it well.
Would it be fair to say that you would have preferred George Ryan as Secretary of State at that time?
I had no preference because I was absolutely without any power to do anything about it. That's a exercise that I didn't need.
Were there any other candidates that you thought might have been in the running as well?
No, I'd have to look back now. I don't. No, at the time, I don't recall any. No.
Yeah, it's only 30 years ago now, looking back. So, okay. Once Edgar got into the position of Secretary of State, he pursued. Many people have characterized his policy positions and his legislative agenda to be untraditional for the Secretary of State, and primarily because of his aggressively going after DUI cases and other things. So let me start by asking you this then. Right from the beginning, he was pushing an agenda to tighten up and to streamline the processing of DUI cases. How effective was he in working with the legislature in this new role as Secretary of State?
I would give him a fair to middle. The regimen that he was postulating was not popular. The members didn't like it. They didn't trust it. It was too hard-nosed for
Democrats, Republicans, both sides.
Both sides. That's one of those issues that crosses county lines, it crosses party lines. You don't know where people are. But he made an effort to sell it. He spent a good deal of time in my office with my staff, spent a good deal of time in Mike's office, good deal of time with the others. And the first couple of times it failed. Couldn't get it done. There was kind of a unholy, uneasy alliance between some of the House and Senate members that they didn't want any part of it.
Where were you at personally with the issue of tightening up on DUI?
Where was I? I was in favor of it. I had been the chief prosecutor of the traffic court of the city of Chicago for the county of Cook, so I was perhaps a little more familiar with the workings of the system and the outcomes that should have happened and sometimes didn't.
Was that one of the issues that was harder to, shall we say, impose some party discipline in terms of how the members were voting?
Yes. Yeah, the members didn't look on that as a party position at all. That was kind of a constituent response.
Did geography play a role that the city Democrats tended to vote differently than the downstate Democrats, for example?
No, I think surprisingly enough, I think that was a shared vote. You, by virtue of that roll call, you couldn't tell who was where.
Okay. Another issue that happened during this time frame that I'm sure you remember, there had been an ongoing fight over the Equal Rights Amendment all the way back from 72, but it really came to a head in 1982 when that was the last effort that the pro-ERA forces saw in being able to push it through, and Illinois was identified as a crucial state. So
right.
Downtown Springfield became something of a battle zone.
Right. What was the name of that lady? She was very tough.
Phyllis Schlafly?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was the very prominent person, head of the Stop ERA movement.
Right. Spent a lot of time in Springfield.
Did she spend some time in your office?
Getting nowhere with me. So, I was very polite, always welcome. Come visit us. But I said, I can't support your...
Well, the reason I mentioned this in terms of a conversation about Secretary of State Edgar at that time is the Secretary of State is responsible for the security and the maintenance of the Capitol building.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of this was going on in the Capitol building. This being, and I just want to get your response to, well, may I ask you this, your position on equal rights before we go into some of the specifics?
I was in favor of.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then as the Senate leader, you had led the charge to pass this on successive times?
Right.
And what was the problem with getting passage as you saw it?
That the constituency in some districts just simply didn't, their attitude was almost twofold. One, it was viewed almost like seatbelts. Leave us alone. It's my car. I drive it the way I want to drive it. Stay away from me. Same with a drink or two. My business, my constituents' business, not your business. Government should stay out of this. And the feelings were pretty strong.
Was this another one of those issues where it wasn't a traditional party line vote?
It was not a traditional party line vote because the party as such, both big parties, didn't want to get involved in it. It was too messy. It was like gun control, or seat belts in the truck and that kind of stuff. It was a hot potato, and they didn't want to touch it.
But
so
you had to touch it from 72 every single year up to 82, didn't you?
Yeah, darn near. And you'll notice if you go back and read a couple of times it happened real early in the session. Just boom, boom.
Mm-hmm.
Bill was on the floor before they knew it, and it was out of committee on the floor, subject to a vote, and the vote killed it. And they just sat down and went, "That's okay. Let's move on. Get rid of it."
A lot of the discussion each year seemed to, you start with a discussion, okay, should we pass this important amendment on a 3/5 vote or a standard majority vote?
Right.
What was the problem with not changing the 3/5? Because the 3/5 requirement stayed through the entire debate.
Right.
Why was that? Why is there reluctance to change that rule?
That was a position taken by the people. They set out their parameters, what they could go for, maybe. But one thing they would not go for, is to change in the rule, to make the rule less stringent in terms of ultimate passage. And I think that was due in large part to Phyllis Schlafly's influence. She explained to all these ladies and women that were down there supporting her and her cause, and said, "This is very important. We have to keep that vote there," And they did it.
What was your particular position on changing the 3/5 vote, the 3/5 requirement?
Yeah, I voted to change it, and as a matter of fact, not 6 months ago, a guy sent me a transcript. He had been going through some files, and he found a transcript where I was arguing with Giddy Dyer. I don't know if you remember Giddy. It's just a nice. She looked like. She looked like everybody's housewife, everybody's grandma, and she was arguing like hell about the 3/5 vote, and so they pitted me against her to argue this point. I said, "Giddy, relax, will you?" But she was intense, and it was reflective of what was going on around her. That, the 3/5 vote, frankly, took on a life of its own, and a life, in my opinion, that it didn't deserve. It really didn't. It wasn't that big a deal.
But if they had been successful and changed the 3/5 rule to a simple majority,
then we would have been in court, yeah.
It would have been in court. But you also, assuming it would have been successful and ERA would have passed in Illinois.
Well, ERA would have, ERA with the rule would have passed probably, and then they'd been in court. So,
okay. The reason I brought the ERA issue up is because, again, Secretary of State Edgar is in charge of the building. And in 1982, a series of things happened when this Illinois is the battleground for the entire country. And people are coming from, a lot of women are coming from across the country to protest. There's a 6,000 person march in Springfield that year.
right.
But and there's a hunger strike, a 37-day hunger strike.
And we had the ladies chained to the podium, or they chained themselves to the podium.
And that was inside the Capitol building. So that gets to the issue of now the head cop for the Secretary of State building, you could say, is Secretary of State Edgar.
Right.
How do you think he acquitted himself on dealing with those particular issues? The chaining of the women to the...
I'm not sure that anybody really scrutinized what he was doing. It was very dramatic with the handcuffs around the podium, the 6 of them, and they were looking up at me, and I kept telling them, just relax, don't get yourself upset. I said, we'll go in the office afterwards and talk and see if we can plow some ground here. And they just kept right on chugging. And then later on, of course, they threw blood on the Capitol lawn, which didn't endear them to their people.
As I remember, that was right outside the Senate chambers where they spilled the blood, and that was after the final defeat of the bill. So you don't recall any of the specific actions that were taken to remove the women?
The only thing I recall is we had a meeting after the session, and I cautioned, and I think Jim listened because he didn't quite know what to do with this, and understandably nobody did. These are citizens, for Christ's sake. What are you going to do with them? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, we had a meeting in my office, and then it was being discussed as to how we were going to handle this situation. These people were chained to the podium, and they're still there, and pain in the neck, and so forth and so on. Finally decided to have an early morning wake-up call and off to jail. And that's what they did. So that no spectator around, nobody, no citizen that could get hurt or get involved. It was just a police effort that the police marched in, got all 6 of them by the hand, and walked them into the saloon, walked them into jail.
Okay.
And it worked out fine.
Next issue that I'm sure that Secretary of State Edgar was pushing hard through the legislature happened towards the end of his time as Secretary of State, and that was the mandatory auto insurance for all drivers in Illinois. Mm-hmm. Did that work its way out the same way that the DUI, tightening up the DUI did? Was that a popular and an unpopular issue for those in the legislature to deal with?
I think more popular than unpopular. It started out years ago, 16, 17 years earlier, that they couldn't pass it. The insurance industry was much too important and powerful. And over the years, the feelings kind of, nobody got too excited anymore. And so a final passage was a piece of cake.
Was Edgar then more successful in that effort to work with the legislature to get the bill that he was shooting for?
Yes.
Than he was for the DUI case?
Yes.
Was there some maturity in him in him as a politician to do that, you think, or is
Well,
this
I
the
think,
issue?
Yeah, I think the issue lent itself, and again, it had been in the mix for every year for 16 or 17 years and was failed.
Okay, 1989 then, Jim Thompson announces that he's not going to run for re-election.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the election year of 1990 is looming. Were you at all surprised when Edgar announced that he was going to run for governor?
Yes.
Why?
I don't know. He just. I don't mean to sound like I know what I'm talking about in terms of Republican politics. I really don't. But he just seemed to be an unlikely subject for candidacy for governor. That there were others around, like George Ryan, like some others that better suited for it.
Did you understand, though, that Jim Thompson thought that Edgar was the top candidate?
Right, I did. He told me that.
Okay. Did he explain why when he told you that?
No, I didn't ask him to explain why. I just took him at his word.
Okay. Your impressions, your memories about that campaign season. Edgar had a primary candidate, but Steve Baer, that he ran, Baer being a much more conservative candidate than Edgar, won rather handily in the primary. Then you get into this really tough major campaign season with Neil Hartigan, the Attorney General at the time. Your thoughts about that campaign and the way it turned out?
I was surprised that Neil was not stronger than he was in terms of the race and the outcome. But you have to give the devil his due. Jim Thompson is a terrific campaigner. And
Jim Thompson or Jim Edgar?
Jim Edgar. Thompson is too, but he was picked up. He was very adaptable and picked up by the people, and just much better than Neil.
Is that to say you think Neil lost the race more than Edgar won it?
No, I don't want to take anything away from Edgar in that one. He won it. He won it fair and square. But I don't think Neil was the right candidate. I guess that's the better way to put it.
Who did you think at the time would have been the better candidate for the Democratic Party?
Me.
And why didn't you run? I didn't expect that, I guess.
Okay. Personal choice. I had, frankly, at that point, that was early '80. I was retiring. I had announced retirement, and I just had enough. You get to a point, or I got to a point where the family became very important. I had 4 kids and 12 grandchildren, and had other things I wanted to do. So I said, that's enough.
So you took yourself out of the running.
Yeah.
Had the party, some of the party leadership approached you about running?
Some, not all, some.
Where Richard M. Daley had been mayor for only a couple years, was he one that approached you on it?
No, we talked about it.
By that time, Madigan certainly would have been a major force of the Democratic Party. Was he one that approached you on it or talked to you about it?
No, he was for Stevenson, was he not, as I recall?
Well, that would have been '86, I think.
Okay. Well, they were not flocking to me as the savior. I was one of the workhorses in the chamber, and they could not have beaten me on the issues, I'll tell you that much.
Okay. Let's get to...
Can we... how far are you from a break point?
This would be a good point, because I'm going to get into the Edgar as governor years. So let's go ahead and take a pause here.
That'd be wonderful.